In the discussion of the Riverbank affair and the symposium dedicated to it that ends the foregoing Freer Medal acceptance address, I may seem to be unduly harsh toward an old friend and colleague who was my adversary in that affair. That is to say, One reader of the talk, has suggested as much to me. In the symposium for One Fong's retirement back in April of 2006, I gave a paper titled One Fong and Me. You can read it on my website as CLP155, in which I relate near the beginning how One Fong and I decided soon after we had met not to carry on a feud, as some of our predecessors had done, for instance Laura and Carlgren, but to go on being friends who respected one another even while we argued. That was true enough so far as it goes, but it was only a partial truth, the positive part, appropriate for an occasion that was, after all, his big bash. But the Freer Medal talk, nearly 5 years later, was my big bash, and it didn't seem inappropriate, especially since I was honoring Sherman Lee as one of my medal predecessors, to reveal more about what really happened. And now, in an addendum to that talk, I feel that it's time, some 11 years after the event, to reveal still more, to open up some large truths about that symposium that I've kept quiet about until now. I should add that although I'm talking from my own standpoint as an individual, pretty much everything I'll say can be documented or backed up by others who were there, and from correspondence or published materials. It's not, that is, simply my opinion against someone else's. It's an account of what really happened. I'll be showing some of that correspondence, by the way. Okay, first images, please. The symposium. Consider the makeup of the symposium. On my side, so to speak, questioning the painting's age and authenticity, were two people. Sherman Lee, who could speak only briefly and with difficulty, so that his argument probably didn't get through to much of the audience, and, next please, Hironobu Kohara, whose paper dealt with some rather esoteric matters in the work's purported provenance. Kohara, although also not in good health, came all the way from Japan to be present. But he was unable to deliver his paper, and it was summarized by One Fong in a 5-minute presentation that made it sound funny. The audience was laughing, while poor Kohara sat there feeling, I'm sure, rather embarrassed. Next, please. Wai Gam Ho was there to give a paper, but it was on a subject completely unrelated to Riverbank, and he stayed non-committal about that painting, so he was neither support nor opposition. Ranged against us, leaving aside the two referees who performed well their somewhat neutral functions, I'll come to them in a minute, they were Jerome Silbergelt and Robert Harris. Leaving these aside, ranged against us were the pro-Riverbank papers by, next please, One Fong and Mike Hearn themselves, and two more by the famous Chinese calligraphy specialist Qi Gong, next please, and by One Fong's former student Shi Shou Chen, both arguing strongly for the age and authenticity of the work. Next please. The two referees, as I say, gave talks that were relatively neutral, although Jerome Silbergelt, who had himself become a Princeton professor by then, ended up feeling that Riverbank was some kind of old painting. Robert Harris, the other referee and a former Princeton student, now teaching at Columbia University in New York, may have been too neutral. I heard later that he was in some trouble with his old teacher, One Fong, for not coming out more strongly in support of the painting. But that's only a story I heard, not verifiable, and I offer it only as that. Next. Richard Barnhart, most vociferous of Riverbank believers, who had written some heavy invective in missives to my journalist friend Carl Nagin and myself, was there to deliver opening remarks. Ding Shiyuan, the Chinese scholar who had published a pro-Riverbank paper about its purported provenance, was brought from Shanghai to confront me dramatically as he did. Even all these were not enough. Also brought in, to reinforce and round out the opposition, so to speak, not so to speak really, were two scholars with whom I had been carrying on for several years each scholarly arguments about the authenticity of particular paintings. Both were called back now to deliver once more their anti-Cahill sides in these controversies. Next, please. One of these was Wang Go Wang, H.C. Wang, arguing against the authenticity of Chen Hongshou's 1635 Tall Pine and Taoist Immortal, a self-portrait in the landscape, which I not only believed in, but had made the centerpiece of one chapter in my compelling image book. Next. And the other was Stephen Little, one of the three colleagues, the others were Dick Barnhart and Mike Hearn, with whom I had carried on a long controversy by mail about the authenticity of a painting ascribed to Dujin, the examining antiquities picture in the National Palace Museum, Taipei, which they took to be genuinely from his hand and which I believe to be a copy. For this you can see the Dujin Correspondence, 1994-95, which is published in Kaikodo Journal number 5 for 1997, pages 8 to 62. It's quite long. It was also one of the cases treated in Postlude B to this series, the one on dating and authenticity. Okay, now these two were brought back again to present again in full-length papers their positions in these controversies, with no counter-arguments possible from me. Next, please. My paper was devoted entirely to why Riverbank cannot be a genuinely old painting, and the discussion sessions that ended the day with all of us on stage didn't really allow much real argument. It was, in short, a massively stacked symposium, clearly intended as a Clobber Cahill event. That it didn't quite turn out that way was no fault of the organizers. I noticed how unevenly stacked it was, of course, when I first heard the makeup of the symposium, and I raised the question in a letter to Wenfong, dated August 2nd, 1999, writing this, and I quote, you can see it here. Slow-witted as I am, I had one of those middle-of-the-night revelations several hours later, that is after hearing by phone about the makeup of the symposium from Judith Smith, who was co-organizing the symposium with Wenfong, end quote, going on, realizing where this was going. And I phoned Judith the next day to ask about the subject of Wango's paper. And sure enough, it's the 1638 Tall Pines and Immortal, end quote, and so on, about my ongoing argument with Wango Wang concerning this painting. And I continued then, quote, now, does this look more than a little stacked? Except for Wygom and the Trubner Steely, all the other papers are addressed to controversies for which I'm strongly identified as the opposition. Does it seem in this light somewhat unbalanced also that except for myself and Jerome as discussant, everybody in the symposium is either Chinese or Princeton, Yale, or both? Question mark. Aren't there others, including proper academic specialists, in parenthesis, as Wango, for all his strengths, isn't, who could have given equally good and interesting papers on authenticity questions? People from elsewhere? I don't think I'm being paranoid, parens in the popular non-technical sense, end parens, in raising these questions. And so forth. That's my end of the quotation. And so forth. I won't quote more of my letter. Next, please. Wenfong responded with a letter dated August 6th, in which he rambled on at length about the planning of the symposium and how innocent it was. One paragraph begins, quote, my own feeling is that while we must all take our work seriously, we should perhaps not take ourselves too seriously. If, as it turns out, all the symposium papers but one deal with issues you have taken a position in, all it means is that you, as a senior scholar, have thought and written about these problems. It cannot mean that you are, quote, strongly identified as the opposition, end quote, and so forth. He opens another paragraph by writing this, quote, although I am nonplussed that for all the evidence we have marshaled, you have not changed your mind at all about Riverbank, let me assure you that there will be no Cahill bashing in December, end quote. And later he writes, honestly, Jim, I only wish you would stop being paranoid about cabals of Chinese or Princeton/Yale or both. It is politically incorrect, end quote. I should say here that all this correspondence, along with my other papers, will be sent before long to the archive in my name at the Freer Gallery, and will be accessible to scholars and others, so I'm only revealing these excerpts a bit prematurely, doing while I'm still alive, so to speak, what I should properly wait until I'm dead to do. Okay, let me diverge for a moment to consider this idea of a Princeton/Yale and Chinese cabal. about which I was accused of being paranoid. Was I really? I don't think so. A grad student at Princeton, who was an old friend, wrote about overhearing Wen Fong, Dick Barnhart, and others having a kind of council of war in which they talked of controlling, job-wise, the whole East Coast and Taiwan, leaving some of the West Coast to me. She is still alive and could be consulted if anybody doubted the truth of this report. I made a joke about this in my Wen Fong and me talk at his retirement bash, but it was no joke. Next, please. If anybody doubts how effective it was, they have only to make a survey of who holds Chinese art history jobs on the East Coast or on Taiwan. It's former Princeton students who occupy the jobs at Taiwan National University, and one of them, Shi Chen, became director of the Palace Museum and was instrumental in getting Riverbank hung for a time alongside the three great Sung landscapes there, where it looked quite ridiculous. Next. Or look at who holds Chinese art history jobs in Great Britain. Apart from Craig Clunas, who is local, they are mostly former Princeton students. These are Roderick Whitfield and Shane McCausland. I could add others. Next. I myself didn't exactly suffer from this, although having my students so restricted in the jobs open to them wasn't pleasant. But my students did suffer. One of the best of them, Howard Rogers, was invited to Harvard to lecture when they had their Chinese art job to fill. And he left after his lecture with a virtual assurance that the job was his. But then the powers there reconsidered, and the position was given to John Hay, Princeton Ph.D. Howard, who heard about this only several weeks afterwards, he was traveling in between, was so shattered that he gave up an academic career altogether and moved permanently to Japan, divorcing his then wife and marrying a new one, Mary Ann, also my student, and formerly married to another Berkeley art historian, Lynn Madison. The two of them were eventually to become very successful dealers, as many of you know, founding the company Kaikodo. That's another long story. It's also true, and verifiable in correspondence, that my writings were virtually off-limits to Princeton Yale students, at least for positive citations. I once asked Dick Barnhart about this. In one of our many long correspondences, we corresponded in multi-page letters in those days. This was before emails. We were just then engaged in one argument by mail about, next please, about Bada Shanran, or Zhu Da, the great 17th century individualist master. Dick and another, Wang Fengyu, had just organized a big exhibition of his works and published a catalog. And I had published an article on, quote, the madness in Bada Shanran's paintings, madness itself in quotes, which I thought had some new and important things to say about this controversial master. But they all acted and wrote as though my article never existed, except to attack it, as one of them tried to do, with results not very positive for her. Okay, Dick didn't deny at all that my writings were more or less anathema for their students. He wrote back saying, in effect, that they didn't cite my writings because they always had such wrong-headed ideas in them. In this case, the argument that Bada had a real bout of madness in his early life and wasn't just pretending madness, as Dick and his students wanted to believe. Anyway, it was generally true, and remains so to this day, that former Princeton and Yale students avoid citing my writings. I recently happened by chance on the internet on a long reading list for a course on readings in Chinese painting studies, given at a British university, and no Cahill was there. So I wondered, and I looked at the top, and sure enough, a former Princeton student was teaching it, the same who organized a big symposium on Gu Kaizhi, inviting lots of people, but conspicuously not myself. I attended anyway, to their annoyance. That's another story. Next, please. Getting back to the Issues in Authenticity Symposium and the way it was massively stacked against me. I was scarcely in a position to protest or argue for changing the program. It was, after all, a Met symposium, and I had no other allies among established academics willing to take the public stand that Lee and Kohara took. Younger colleagues, as once more I could document from my boxes of Riverbank correspondence, younger colleagues quite understandably were uneasy about the effect on their own careers and the future of their students if they went up against the powerful forces that dominated too much of the job market. At the symposium, there were those in the audience who joined me in believing that this was not a genuinely old painting, but they didn't have a chance to speak out. Next, please. It's completely untrue, however, as one of my former students has argued in recent correspondence with me, that I was virtually alone in taking Riverbank to be a forgery by Zhang Chen. My good friend John Rosenfield, who taught Japanese art history at Harvard until his retirement, wrote me about how he had been in the gallery the next day listening to the crowds around Riverbank arguing, and he reported that the general public seemed to be mostly on Wenfeng's side and the specialists on mine. And I had been backed up in correspondence from people who agreed with me, but for whatever reason weren't ready to appear in public, saying so. This will become abundantly clear to any future researcher going through the boxes of correspondence. But let me give a few examples. One former student of mine, an established scholar-teacher, was holding a seminar with grad students on Zhang Chen, and they had concluded quite independently of me that Riverbank had to be by him. We corresponded about this, and she sent me slides of works they used in making the identification. But she finally wrote me a handwritten note, dated July 26, that accompanied a slide of one more of Zhang's paintings that could be used for comparison with Riverbank. An image made from that slide is now on screen. And her note ended, quote, "I'm really sorry I'm not ready to go public with my instincts on this yet, ... haha, end quote." And this is followed by several crossed-out words, suggesting strong feelings necessarily left unwritten. Next, please. I had given a newly acquired photo of Riverbank to my student Richard Vinograd as an unknown in the connoisseurship section of his doctoral exams in 1976, more than 20 years earlier. And he had written 2 close-type pages about it, with sharp observations about what was wrong with it as an early painting. He ended with this, quote, "Over the whole painting there hangs an air of suggestive obscurity, along with scattered hints of early styles that allow the viewer to fill in mental images of ill-understood early landscape styles, while failing ultimately to really render the basic qualities that would qualify it as an early landscape," end quote. Wow. Anybody who can write like that under the pressure of a doctoral exam is going to go on to a distinguished career, as indeed he has. Next, please. Anyway, Rick Vinograd, great guy. He continues, quote, "I would suggest that it is a relatively recent pastiche, possibly as early as the time of Wang Hui, that would be 17th or early 18th century, but more likely a good deal more modern," end quote. I quoted this in my Met talk with Rick's permission. When asked about it later by others, he backed off a bit and wondered whether the painting might be earlier, maybe 14th century. I'm not criticizing either him or my other student. They had good, solid reasons for not coming out strongly and openly against the painting, whatever their true feelings were. That would quite possibly have had serious consequences for them and for their students. It's significant that the only people who did come out that way were 3 old retired scholars who were in secure positions. That is, Kohara, Sherman Lee, and myself. Next, please. Harry van der Stoppen, longtime professor at the University of Chicago, wrote me on August 8, 1997. I'll reproduce his handwritten note here, which you can read. "Dear Jim, I just read Carl Nagin's New Yorker piece on the New York Mets, quote, Mona Lisa." Nagin's piece had quoted the New York Times front page article that described this great new acquisition as the Mona Lisa of Chinese painting. That's my interpolation. On with Harry. "I saw it again a few weeks ago. It is a pastiche. I am so glad you spoke out. Congratulations. How can such blatant misrepresentations be taken seriously? I guess the old adagio," I think he means, the old adage. "The old adage still holds, quote, the bigger the lies, the better they hold. The Met's holdings in Chinese paintings are sprinkled with many dubious Mona Lisas. No comparison with the paintings in Boston. Congratulations. I am very happy with your comments. As ever, Harry." Dear Harry. Okay, next please. I received a letter dated December 31st, 1997, from a man named Steve Gaskin, who was then unknown to me, but whom I later came to know well. He was a Boston collector, an enthusiast for Chinese painting, and for a time president of the, I think it is New England Seminar on East Asian Art, something like that, a group organized originally by Susan Bush that met monthly to hear talks on their favorite materials. Steve Gaskin writes about his enthusiasm for Chinese painting and his membership in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts support group called Friends of Asiatic Art. And he continues this way, quote, "Recently I visited the Met's new Chinese painting display and viewed the Riverbank firsthand. At that time I had not yet heard any of the controversy surrounding the painting, although I wondered why I had never seen it in a book, if it was indeed so important. I stood before it and was amazed to find that I did not care much for the painting. This was a surprise, since other famous examples of early landscape painting, for instance Fan Quan, Guoxi, Li Sheng, are clearly of the highest quality. The Riverbank looked to me like a painting by someone familiar with Western perspective techniques, even more than Zhang Hong, and the prominence of the scholar and his residents looked more like something from Tang Nin than Fan Quan or Guoxi. Those are both Ming artists, Zhang Hong, Tang Nin. Okay. Not that I regard myself as any sort of authority in these matters," end quote. And he goes on to relate how he talked about this with Wu Tong at the Museum of Fine Arts, who told him about the controversy. Later he read the New Yorker article, and he adds this, quote, "I just wanted to say, for what it's worth, that I think what you said about both paintings was well worth saying," end quote. Later, Steve Gaskin was to correspond with me about the supposedly early seals on Riverbank, and he published an article about them, in which he showed how they didn't match the genuinely old seals that they were supposed to be. I myself have never believed that much in matching seals as a useful way to determine age and authenticity, but I appreciated his effort anyway. Okay. In a later letter to me, written on May 21st, 1999, Gaskin asked this, quote, "Has anyone examined the different silk weaves in different fragments of the painting? Did you notice all the disturbances in the silk right in and around the borders of the signature? It's as if it's made up of a large number of small pieces of silk, judging by the look of the warp and weft of the fragments," end quote. This is a good and valuable observation, especially because that false aging of the silk is an observable characteristic of Zhang Dachen's fakes. Next, please. Here are two of them. At left, a close-up detail from the Chernusky's so-called Han-Gan, Horses and Grooms, and at right, a detail from the Freer Gallery's Three Worthies of Wuzhong, both of them recognized now as Zhang Dachen forgeries. And they both show exactly the kind of artificial ripping of the silk vertically and horizontally into fragments that Gaskin observed in Riverbank. I don't have detailed slides of this kind for Riverbank, alas, I can't show them to you. I remember looking at the Freer painting through magnification with Takashi Sugiura, the Freer's mounter, who was very sharp-eyed and knowledgeable about painting silks, and his pointing out that the damaging, the vertical and horizontal tearing of the silk into rectangular fragments, was completely unlike genuine aging of silk, and was a clear indication of fakery. The fibers of the silk, he said, were still strong, so the renting was deliberately done, the ripping. If, as I believe, the same is true of the silk of Riverbank, that would be still another strong indication, not that any more are needed, that the look of age is artificially produced. Next, please. Bringing up the matter of the silk raises a big issue. Big because Wenfong and Mike Hearn have tried to use the purported oldness of the silk of Riverbank as positive proof that it couldn't be a modern forgery. They had borrowed the British Museum's Juron fake, which had come to be recognized as a work by Zhang Dachen, to hang beside Riverbank so that everybody could see the difference in their appearance, which was supposed to prove the antiquity of Riverbank. But of course it did nothing of the kind. It only showed that Zhang had been more careful and skillful in aging the one than the other. Fortunately, I had read through Wenfong's old paper, which is a good and important piece of writing in itself, titled, quote, "The Problem of Forgeries in Chinese Painting," published in 1962 in Artibus Asiae, volume 25, part 2 to 3. In a long footnote there, note 46, Wenfang had related how the silk in the would-be Dunhuang Bodhisattva painting, this is a Zhang forgery, the next please, which was the main subject of his paper, in which he correctly identified as a copy after an actual Dunhuang wall painting, he related how this was subjected to exhaustive technical examination in a Japanese laboratory, and how it passed with flying colors. Microscopically and chemically, he writes, it was thought that everything looked just as one might expect of a handsome specimen of Tang workmanship. There were in fact plans afoot to publish the findings as a standard textbook on technical analysis of a Tang painting. It is clear, therefore, Wenfang concludes, that scientifically ascertained data must be interpreted not only in the framework of the stylistic evidence of the painting, but also according to our special historical insight with regard to the problem in question, end quote. I quoted this at length in my talk, only at the end identifying the source, and I added that if I were to choose between believing this 1962 Wenfang and the 1999 one, I would choose the 1962 one. By the 1999 Wenfang, I meant the one who had written in the preface to the symposium volume, and I quoted him, quote, while the attribution of Riverbank to Dongran may never be proven, it is important for us to recognize that, based on physical as well as stylistic analysis, the painting cannot be a work of the 20th century, nor the creation of the renowned modern forger Zhang Daqian, end quote. But, as I will show in an addendum to my postlude B, the one on dating and authenticity issues, it is demonstrably exactly that. Exactly a forgery by Zhang Daqian. Next, please. Realizing that the silk of the painting was going to be an issue, I had corresponded with the one person whom I knew who had made a careful study of the silk on which old Chinese paintings were done, and that's Robert Mowry, seen here, who was curator at what had been the Fogg Museum. I still refuse to use the new name. Anyway, the Asian Art Museum at Harvard. Next, please. He responded in a long letter written on March 2nd, 1998, saying that he had read Carl Nagin's article in the New Yorker, quote, not to mention the Met's trumpet blasts in the New York Times at the time their new galleries opened. What a mess! And to rank that painting alongside the Mona Lisa and the Taipei Fanquan and Guaxi scrolls is just ludicrous, even if it were genuine, and I use the subjunctive very deliberately. It would be just an old painting, not an important old painting, let alone a masterpiece, end quote. Later in his long letter, he writes that he had seen the painting years before, but hadn't paid close attention to the silk, and now could not examine it closely enough under glass at the Met to draw a conclusion. And he adds, quote, even if the silk turns out to be, quote, old, I don't think the painting is of the same age, end quote. Mowry was in the symposium audience, but he didn't speak. There was no provision for audience participation. Next, please. Finally, another close observation by Sherman Lee, his 8-minute talk at the symposium about the impossible treatment of water in Riverbank, didn't represent his whole opinion. It was only what he felt he could deliver in his weakened state. He had sent me earlier a handwritten note, dated April 1st, 1998, now on the screen, after getting detailed photographs of Riverbank from the Met, and he writes this, quote, I have the photos, and I cannot believe them. 90% modern, 10% yuan. I'm not sure what he means by that. I think he must mean 1 chance in 10, it's earlier yuan. But anyway, later he came out clearly that it was modern pastiche. Anyway, going on. The confusion in the house garden in the detail at slightly above lower left is unbelievable. Confusion everywhere, but there supreme. One group of trees becomes a fog, becomes the next row, etc., etc. The fish scale patterning on the water has no structure. Trees pass out en route to the next passage. Tiles are laid out in a structure so lazy as to be beyond belief. You must mean tiles in the house. I'm not clear there. Anyway, continuing. A river becomes a path. Water defies belief. I will go public after I have had a look at the original in the Met over the April 14th period, end quote. And he adds at the bottom, I can't write an essay, obviously no control over my writing, but I can talk. Haha, great. Next, please. I could continue with more, but that should be enough for anyone with an open mind and open eyes. Let me close by making again an observation I wrote to Kohara-san after the symposium, and have repeated elsewhere later. It is this, quote, "If a similar situation were to occur in the field of European painting, it would be, quote, signed work of a major old master whose surviving oeuvre is small and highly problematic, let's say Giorgione, appearing suddenly in the hands of a known master forger, looking like nothing anyone had ever seen before, and with no plausible provenance. If these were to happen in the field of European painting, the work in question would be quickly laughed off the scene." That Riverbank has been taken seriously, at least as some kind of old painting, by so many in our field, tells us something, I believe, about the state of the field. End quote. The truth of the above observations would appear to be so self-evident that, along with the obviously impossible features of the painting, they would seem to force a recognition of the spuriousness of Riverbank. Do my older colleagues understand this? I believe that on some level most of them do. Are they willing to acknowledge understanding it? Admit what they know to be true? Of course not. That would be turning pro-Cahill, and for most of them that's scarcely thinkable. Will any of them attempt to respond to the above paragraph, or to any of the rest of the foregoing? Highly unlikely. If even the suggestion of Craig Clunas, delivered after the symposium, that the right judgment of the whole affair might be the old Scottish verdict of not proven, is in this sense a cop-out. In short, there's still a lot of weaseling going on. On the matter of riverbanks having no plausible provenance, let me quote from what I recently wrote to a colleague and former student who still believes in the antiquity of Riverbank. Quote, "Xu Beihong is supposed to have found it and acquired it in 1938 from an unnamed source in Yangshuo, Guangxi province, and kept it for years without showing it to anyone, except his friend Zhang Daqian, even though he recognized it as a great early work. Then he gave it to Zhang in exchange for a Jin Nung, that is Qing period 18th century, a Jin Nung painting he especially liked. And then Zhang in turn kept Riverbank for years without showing it to anyone until ... and so forth. And if you believe that, I have some great Tong Sung paintings I'll sell you." So ends this documented section of my treatment of Riverbank. In an added part 2 of Addendum B, the one on judging priority and authenticity, I'll give some of the visual evidence for its being a modern forgery. And I firmly believe, and I hope you will also, after hearing and seeing all this evidence, the work of Zhang Daqian. That's all for today, and I feel very relieved at having at last revealed all this long bottled up information.